Hello, and welcome to our live webcast today on positive behavioral support in the workplace. We have a really big topic to cover today in a very short period of time, so I don't really expect that you're going to become an expert in this topic in this short period of time. However, what I intend to do or hope to accomplish is give you a few strategies that you can think about when you go to work later today or perhaps tomorrow, with the idea that you're going to be looking for additional assistance and resources. I'd like to start and ask you to think about how you view people with disabilities. Now, I think oftentimes we perhaps think of people with disabilities differently from ourselves, and we think, well, they have challenging behaviors, or they have behaviors that perhaps you or I don't have. A couple of years ago, I found a very interesting handout that really made me think about how I thought about people with challenging behaviors, and what it did was it sort of compared our behaviors, perhaps things that you and I do, versus things that an individual with a disability might do. So let's look at some comparisons between how we view people with disabilities. Now, since we're thinking about this in the context of the workplace, I came up with some ideas that perhaps would apply to your job or mine. And I'm asking you to think, well, let's think about ourselves. We take a break. But perhaps when we think about people with disabilities in the workplace, we might say that they are off task. Or perhaps we say we stand up for our opinions in the workplace, while someone else might have difficult challenges and they're considered non-compliant. Perhaps we think we change our minds and they have short attention spans. Or we might try to make friends in the workplace while they have attention-seeking behaviors. This particular handout made me stop and think, really related to how we might see people in general. Now think about yourself. Most behaviors serve a purpose for you or for me, and I think most of us have interfering behaviors. Now you might stop for a minute and think about yourself. Think of some things that you might have done yesterday, the day before. Did you take a break that was perhaps a little bit too long? Did you get up from your desk or leave your workstation, or perhaps go out to your car when you might have thought you should be working with the customer on his job site? So think about some of the things that you or I do, and then think about that in relationship to an individual with a disability. Perhaps we're really more the same than we are different. As we're thinking about people today, I think the other thing that we really get caught up in is really labeling people. And I would really challenge you, if you don't remember anything else that I talk about today, please remember this when we're talking about supporting people who need extra support in the workplace. Let's not say that they're non-compliant. Let's not talk about people being withdrawn. Let's refrain from saying that someone is uncooperative. And I think that you could probably think of a million things yourself if you were sitting there, or labels that perhaps we have given to people who have really extra support needs. And let's try to think about it from the perspective of extra support needs. Now, before we go on to another slide, I really would like to just comment a little bit more about how we think about behavior in the workplace, our behavior versus perhaps someone that we are supporting. A real key concept for me is that you and I really know when we are perhaps doing something that we shouldn't be doing in the workplace. Perhaps we realize when we've talked a little bit too long to a coworker, or we realize we've stayed away from what we really were hoping to accomplish within a set period of time. These are things that probably the individual with a disability is not aware of. So we know when we hear the boss's footsteps coming down the hall that perhaps we should suddenly get busy and look busy and get our books out or get our whatever assignment or work task that we're trying to accomplish out so that the boss sees us busy instead of talking to our coworker at the water fountain. I think this is something that we really need to think about when we are assisting the individuals in their workplaces. We need to assist them in learning really that work culture, learning how to fit in, how to be socially appropriate within the workplace. These are skills that they haven't really often typically learned. So I think it's really, really important to consider. The next thing that I think it's really critical to consider is that all behaviors serve a function for us. And that is really key when we're looking at people in their workplaces, or even if we're working with individuals in other community environments, or even within our workshops, if you are working within a workshop setting, that there are possible functions of all behaviors, so that let's look more closely at what really that is accomplishing for the individual. And typically, if we can find out what the individual is trying to say to us, then perhaps we can be more successful in supporting that person in integrated community environments. Now, the first thing that I really like to think about and to encourage you to think about is for those people who really don't have good communication skills, who really can't tell us what the problem is, what the concern is. So perhaps what we're seeing and what we might see as a challenge or an extra support need in the workplace is really the person trying to tell us something. Another issue is that for some people, these extra support needs or these challenges that we're seeing have really come to be a way that the person can control the environment. And so perhaps it means that they're getting extra attention from coworkers, and that's what's really creating the problem. Or perhaps you're not able to fade from the work site because the person is doing something that is seen as difficult, and really that's the person's way of controlling you and controlling the situation and maintaining your presence in the workplace. And that really feeds to our next point, which is really attention. And I would caution you to remember that for some people who have never had much attention, that even negative attention, when we say please don't do that, or please go back to work, or please don't go do that, even negative attention can be perceived as positive for the individual who has those extra needs in the workplace. So I think that is really key or important to remember. Before we move on from that slide, I really would also caution you to think about, if we go back to the point on communication, what perhaps the person might be trying to tell us, which reminds me of a situation at one point where we had placed a young gentleman into a workplace, and he tended to have extra support needs, and almost from the first day of work, he began hitting his face. Now, it would be very easy to jump to the conclusion that the person did not like that job. It was early on, it was the first or second day, and we thought, well, oh my goodness, we're going to have to do something about this. We've never seen this individual do this in the past. But we stopped, we thought, what is the function of this? What perhaps could this individual be trying to tell us? And we stopped, we thought, we talked to his parent, his mother, and absolutely found out that the problem was that he had a severe toothache. Now, not all support needs are going to be solved in that simple a manner, or as in this case, a trip to the dentist. But we really do need to think about what the person is trying to communicate to us when they are talking or displaying some of the challenging behaviors. Along that line, some other important things to consider really would be control. And in this situation, I don't really mean control that the person is displaying the difficult challenge related to trying to control the situation, but rather we have given limited control to people with disabilities. And therefore, when we say, congratulations, here is your job, and that individual has no input into what that job is, then we have really, I think, perhaps done a disservice, and we have maybe set ourselves up for some challenges related to the fact that we haven't looked and seen what the interests of the person actually are, and really thinking about where that person can have some control around the situation. The other really important thing that I think we need to think about is relationships. We're taking someone who perhaps has never been in the workplace before, and these are people that they have never met before. And so really in the beginning we may have some issues because there are no relationships between this individual, the supervisor, the coworkers. And that in and of itself could create some concerns or issues. So we need to really focus on day one on how we're going to build those relationships and not put ourselves between the individual and the coworkers. The next thing that I would really challenge you to think about is to think about really brainstorming with your coworkers yourself when you have issues or concerns with a particular person and their support needs. Because we can't accomplish all of these things ourselves. And you might just be more successful if in fact you brainstorm with the person who's having the challenges and brainstorm with your coworkers yourself. The last point that you see on this particular slide is community access. And within the context of community access, I think it's very important to really evaluate what we're doing with people with disabilities. Unfortunately, I think sometimes excuse me, we limit community access to people because we say they have challenges. So we don't let them go out in the community. We maintain them in our segregated environments, being concerned really about what's going to happen within the community. I'd really like to share with you an example here around community access and around really community expectations. What people within the community perhaps are more tolerant sometimes than maybe you or I are of the individual's challenges. And this reminds me of a young man that we worked with a couple of years ago who was working in a mall. Now his job was negotiated for him, and what he did was he actually cleaned the entrances to the malls, washed the windows, and he had a number of those windows to wash. He'd go from area to area to area. Now this particular job was very well suited to this gentleman because he really liked to move around. So he had some great distances that he could move from one window to another, and he liked to push his cart around. So these were sort of positive things about this particular position. He also really liked to sing. And when I say sing, I perhaps mean that he liked to make loud noises as he moved through the mall and pushed his cart. Well, he had learned his job and he was pretty successful with it. And part of his day, he was there just with his coworkers and the mall walkers who were really familiar with him and would greet him and he would interact with them. And part of his day really was after the mall had opened. Now, remember this particular day when there was going to be an antique show in the mall. Now, that was a kind of interesting plus for me. I'm thinking, well, perhaps today would be a good day to go and visit Michael. And I should comment today, I'm using people's names, but these are not really their names. These are pretty much made-up names, so to protect the confidentiality of the individuals. But I thought, well, today would be a good day, and I'm a little concerned about all these antique dealers that are setting up in the mall. And perhaps Michael with his fast pace of pushing his cart through the mall, and he's used to having pretty much free reign, that could be a problem. So I went out to the mall that day, and I happened to be standing over behind a potted plant that was a rather large potted plant. Now, any of you who are employment specialists probably could really relate to my story about standing behind somewhere so that the individual couldn't see you. Now, occasionally when I start thinking very seriously, I'll get a frown on my face, and I might look like I'm very concerned. So here I am. You can sort of see this picture. I'm standing behind this potted plant, and I've probably got a frown on my face. And one of the antique dealers is setting up her space, and she sees me over here behind the potted plant, where Michael can't see me, by the way, and he happens to be singing very loudly and pushing his cart rather fiercely. And I'm thinking, should I intervene? Should I not intervene? Is he going to hit anything? Should I go over there to him? And so I had this look on my face, I'm sure. And the antique dealer is watching me, not necessarily Michael, and my quote-unquote challenging behaviors and perhaps my support needs. And the antique dealer came over to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, dear, you really don't have to worry. He's not going to do anything. He's just singing. Now, I really give you that story because I think, and some of you who have heard me talk before may know that it's actually one of my favorite stories, because we probably sometimes put barriers in the way of people when the community may perhaps be a lot more forgiving and a lot less demanding than you or I perhaps are. So I would really challenge you to think about that when we are perhaps withholding community access from people that we are working with. And saying that, I would like to say, are we part of the problem or are we the solution? And what I'd like for you to really consider as we're looking at this particular slide is, what have we done in relationship to the job match? We've already touched on the whole idea of making sure that the job matches the person's interests and abilities, even though the individual may have more intensive support needs than someone else. So have we really thought about what that person's support needs are when we do that job match? I know I remember a young woman who really talked a lot, and when I say talked a lot, she really had I guess non-stop vocalizations, and a lot of it was sort of nonsensical. And really the key to working with her in her situation was finding a workplace, obviously, that didn't require her to remain silent. So that's really key. What are the support needs, and can we find a job site that will match those support needs? When I say have we set the person up to fail, it would be to go back to my example of the young woman who talked all the time. If we were to put her into an environment that needed her to remain quiet most of her workday. Another example might be the individual who has very colorful language, or let's be very blunt, uses a lot of obscene language. Certainly we wouldn't put that individual within a workplace where that might be a problem. And hopefully we could match the individual to a work site that would be more appropriate, where perhaps even the coworkers have colorful language, such as within a construction site. Those are things I think that we need to think about when we're discussing, are we part of the problem or are we the solution? When we're really looking at supporting people in the workplace, I would really obviously challenge you to think about positive supports versus negative consequences. Now, unfortunately, I still hear when I talk to employment specialists who are working with people with more intensive support needs, things like, well, if they don't do their job, then they won't get access to something. Now, there might be a very subtle difference here in flipping this around and thinking about giving access to things when people really are positive, when they interact well with the environment. But if we're constantly thinking about negative consequences, then I'm not sure we're going to be very successful. The other side of that is that if we think we're going to eliminate behaviors, then typically what happens is that if you or I were to go into the workplace, we could work very hard and perhaps we could eliminate the challenge. But if you or I are the person that does that, then once we're gone, the person is probably going to go right back to what they were doing before that we perceived as being the support need. So really, another really good point to think about is that you or I, as the employment specialist, really can't be the ones that always implement these things that we're going to, or strategies that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, because primarily the individual needs to learn positive behaviors or strategies so that he or she can manage the situation, or the coworkers also need to have tips and strategies on how to assist the individual into fitting in that workplace. So those are really key things to think about. And if you go for the negative consequence approach, I think what often happens, and if you have children, you could probably think about this from that perspective, is the person who does the punishing is typically going to be the person that gets avoided. So think about that if you are thinking about using negative consequences in the workplace. And obviously it's not really socially appropriate to begin with. One of the old strategies, tried and true strategies that we might take a look at when we are trying to figure out what the person's support needs are within the workplace, and those of you who have been around for a while like I have might remember or have heard of this idea of just doing an ABC analysis of what's going on. And essentially what we're trying to do is find out within the A part of this analysis is what happens before the individual perhaps does this behavior that we have determined is an extra support need for the individual. So what happens before? Is there a trigger in the workplace that really, I don't want to say causes the situation, but in some ways perhaps that's as good a word as any to think about what happens before. Then I would really challenge you to think about what the person really does. And this goes back to my earlier slide where I asked you not to think about the person being non-compliant or the person being withdrawn, because that doesn't really tell us what the person is doing. I want to really know what the person's doing. Is the person sitting down on the floor and refusing to get up? Is the person going to the break room and staying there for 30, 40 minutes at a time and refusing to come out and do the task? I want to know exactly what it is that the person does. Can we tell? Is there anything consistent about what happens before? And then really thinking about what happens after that behavior occurs. Because sometimes it might be what happens after that is maintaining this particular support need as well as what's happening before. So those are really, I think, things that we can take some initial data, probably not the best choice of words, but we can do some observation and get some beginning ideas about what the support needs of the person are. The next thing that I would like to challenge you to think about within the whole context of really trying to identify what the support need of the person is, and we've really already touched on being specific about what it is there any particular time of day that this occurs? How do the coworkers react? How do you react, for that matter? Is there a specific location within this workplace where the particular challenge or support need occurs? Because all of those things can really give you some ideas about how you can go about supporting this individual and being more successful. Another thing that you might want to think about, and this somewhat goes back to what we've already talked about related to our ABC analysis, are there specific situations or conditions within that workplace that the particular challenge occurs, so that we can really look at that? Because I would say that sometimes we can be more successful really about changing what's going on in the workplace, perhaps, than we can be about changing what the person is doing. So really targeting what's going on around the person, and those things can really give us a great deal of success. I'd really like to, and perhaps you can tell already that I like to tell stories, but I'd really like for you to think about the whole issue of, can you identify a specific time of day that this situation occurs? And this reminds me of a time that an employment specialist came to me and said, well, I don't think this particular job site is going to work out because the person is getting food and eating food out of the trash can. And I really can't think of how we're going to stop this. I've tried taking it away from her. Now think about that. If the person said to you, I've tried taking it away from her, that should send a little red flag up in your mind to think about whether it is attention that the individual is looking for. So really, when you're looking at some of these things, I'm kind of asking you to be a detective and to put your thinking cap on and to look really within the context. But I'm kind of digressing from my story there. Really, the first thing that I thought about when we sat down to brainstorm the situation together, my first question was, is there any specific time of day that this is occurring? And when he looked at it and he stopped and he thought, and that's the employment specialist in this situation, he said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, it's almost pretty consistently first thing in the morning. Now, when we explored this, we found out that the person was not eating any breakfast. Again, I'm giving you a simple story, and you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, all of these examples are really simple. But I would also say that sometimes it's the simple things that we tend to overlook when it comes to the support needs of people in their workplaces. So please don't overlook some of those simple things. In this situation, it happened to be so simple as encouraging the person and the group home to ensure that the individual got to eat something prior to leaving for work. Going along some of these lines, let's stop and think a little bit more about what the functions of the behavior is for the individual. Now, this functional analysis really is written pretty extensively about in a book that was written by Meyer and Evans, and I'll have that resource for you posted online, so perhaps you can explore it a little bit further. But when they talked about what is the function of the behavior, what they really ask us to do is to describe exactly what's happened, and I've already sort of challenged you to think about exactly what is going on as opposed to using sort of value-laden statements about it. And then they suggest that you really stop and think about really putting that thinking cap on again. What hypothesis, what alternative explanation could we have around why perhaps this person is displaying this particular support need? Once you come up with that hypothesis or alternative explanation, what they suggest that you do is to really test that by, again, manipulating the environment. Maybe manipulating is not exactly the best choice of words in this particular discussion, but rearranging perhaps would be a better way of looking at it. What can we do that perhaps would assist the individual in being more successful? Let's look at that really more from an example perspective, so that maybe it will make a little more sense to you. In order to do that, we're going to look at it from the perspective of a young gentleman who was working at a Pizza Hut. Now, this particular Pizza Hut was very supportive, and the individual's job task had been negotiated for him, and what he was doing was he was scrubbing pizza pans, filling condiment containers, and putting away supplies around the kitchen once the coworkers were done with them. In this particular situation, very specifically, what the support need was that the individual would scream and run out the back door of the Pizza Hut and sit on the curb and refuse to get up. So that was his particular support need that we needed to address or consider. And looking at this, and you might think, well, I can't imagine that there'd be an employer that would allow someone to scream and run out the back door and sit on the curb. However, again, I would say that the employer in this situation was very supportive and did want this particular individual to be successful. So the first thing that we did in this particular situation was really to start brainstorming as a group what the support need of this individual was, what really perhaps are some of the reasons or alternative explanations. Now, in this particular situation, I think it would be very easy to say, whoops, we're going to throw up our hands. We're going to say, this is not a good job match. I guess we're going to just have to quit the job. And in fact, I would say to you that's what the employment specialist said. I really can't encourage him to get up off the curb once he sits down. And I've tried talking to him. I've tried reasoning with him, and he just won't get up. Now, I would say to you that typically this kind of tug-of-war situation is really not going to do you any good. So perhaps that would be my first tip when I'm thinking about working with an individual who perhaps has this type of support need. It's not going to help you any. The more you talk sometimes, the more resistant the person could perhaps get to be. So I say, well, let's stop and think for a minute. Is it a good job match? The individual really had expressed some interest in working at the Pizza Hut, so perhaps we thought, well, maybe it's something within the situation that the individual is trying to tell us. And I have a long laundry list of things that you were just looking at on the slide. We looked at saying, does he need to take a break? Is this task too simple or is it too complex? Now, I'm not really saying in this situation that it's both of those things, although perhaps the individual does have different work tasks and some of them are too complex and the individual doesn't know how to perform those tasks versus them being too simple and the person perhaps is bored and the job isn't challenging enough. So we need to determine, does the individual know the expectations of the job? Does the individual know how to perform the job? In this situation, perhaps, is it that the environment is too loud? I know of other situations, not in this particular situation, where the environment simply was too loud, and in combination with some of the other support needs of this individual, the volume level of the environment only created anxiety, and then the individual would leave the workstation. And in that situation, perhaps a pair of earplugs might be helpful. Did the person in this situation feel that they were isolated? Did we not work in enough relationship building activities with the coworkers? And in some situations, I think we put people in jobs where they don't understand initially that they're working and they're going to earn money. And so, quite frankly, if you took me out of one environment and put me in the other, and I didn't understand that I was going to earn money for what I was doing, and it was really hard, and you're increasing demands on me, and you're asking for me to do more and more work, and I don't understand what I'm getting out of it, then perhaps any of us would have extra support needs in those situations. So I would ask that you think about that as well. So once we looked at all of those things that it might be that this particular individual was having difficulties with, perhaps what we needed to think about was working in a way for the individual to communicate that he needed to take a break. So perhaps what he was doing when he was running out the back door of the Pizza Hut was that he was trying to tell us that he was, he'd had enough, he needed to take a break. Perhaps we didn't have enough for him to do there, that we needed to alternate some of his preferred tasks within that workplace with some of his less preferred tasks, and that we were pretty aware that some of his less preferred tasks was actually standing at the sink for excessively long periods of time. And looking at changing the instructions so that we know that the individual understands, again, what the expectations are. Does he need more structure to this job? And finally, facilitating relationships in the workplace. I think it's important, again, within the context of this individual to view him from a capacity view, because if we have, as the employment specialist, gotten emotionally involved or look at it from the perspective of that it's our fault, or it's the workplace fault, or it's John's fault, for that matter, that this is occurring. If we get emotionally caught up in this and we stop viewing John from a positive perspective, then I'd say we're probably going to have less chance of being successful with him. So if we look at him from a capacity viewpoint, we perhaps could say that he knows how to get what he wants, that we also know that he likes the Pizza Hut, and one thing that we had learned about him was that he was very particular about things being orderly. And if we looked critically after we had sort of looked at our function test, we might perhaps could say to ourselves, well, this wasn't a very orderly environment, and he likes things that are very neat and very organized. Some other things that we found out about him when we started doing our sort of hypothesis building is that he really didn't like a lot of verbal directions and what was going on. The employment specialist was going outside, verbally encouraging him to get up. That was just escalating the situation as opposed to calming him down. He had never earned a paycheck before, so again, that didn't make any sense to him. As I've already mentioned, the job site was not very structured, and the other thing was that he tended to get very frustrated when he didn't understand what was expected of him. So again, the whole issue of him leaving the workplace and going out back when he got frustrated. So what was done to assist this individual was really to try to place some order into the environment and to give him some control over that order. And basically what was accomplished was that we gave him some ways to self-monitor his work tasks. He was given a sort of picture job duty sequence that he could check off as he finished work tasks. He was also given a small index card that had a circle drawn on it and really divided up into to slices, if you wanted to call it slices, because one of the things that we found out within this particular workplace is that coworkers were able to take pizza home with them that was left at the end of the day off of the buffet. And so what we did was really try to associate with John's check card that he managed himself, really was that an association between initially that if he worked, he could check the work task off on his job duty schedule, again giving him some order within the workplace, and then he could sort of keep count of how many slices of pizza that he was going to get to take home at the end of the day. Really, what also was accomplished within this situation was that it set up a relationship between the co-workers and with John in helping him really keep track of what he was going to get to take home at the end of the day. Now, the other feature of this that we wanted to look at was taking a break. And so let's look a little bit more closely at that around what to do should he still, even after we had put into place his self-management strategies. We wanted to redirect him whenever possible. We didn't want to get into those situations where I talked about really getting into a tug of war with him. So this particular person, you could really read his body language and tell when he was getting a little agitated. And so in that situation, what we did and what the coworkers learned to do was redirect him to take a brief break. So they would say, John, do you need to take a brief break? So redirect him when they noticed that his body language meant that he was becoming frustrated. We've already addressed a little bit the whole idea of remaining neutral. Again, not getting into a tug of war with him and avoiding backing yourself into a corner and being consistent with what you're trying to accomplish. Now, does this mean that the first day that we put the check card in place for him that he was successful? Well, no, it didn't. It was a gradual change. He had to learn how to really self-manage the things that had been a support need for him in the past. Between the employment specialist, the coworker, and John, being consistent and working through the situation, he did, over time, over the course of a couple of weeks, learn how to use his self-management strategy to either change the work task he was doing or to take a brief break. Initially, when he became agitated, the employment specialist allowed him to go out back. Then, after 1 minute, she would go back and say, I see you need to take a break. Let's take a minute break. And then she would leave. She would stop getting into that tug of war that I mentioned before. Now, he quickly learned that there was no attention for sitting out on the curb. And in this particular situation, he was not someone who ran away, so there wasn't a real critical safety issue. And he really quickly pretty much learned that the intention was inside the Pizza Hut and not outside. So between his sort of self-management procedures and the discontinuing of getting attention for that behavior, he became pretty successful pretty quickly. I'd like to see if we have time for just one more quick example. This particular young woman really had a lot of things going for her, but she had come from a workplace where there weren't many, I guess, expectations placed on her. But she was extremely social. She was a very steady worker, and she had sort of displayed that she wanted to have a job at a restaurant based on some situational assessments that we had done with her. The job task that was really structured for her, I guess negotiated for her, was rolling silverware at a restaurant. And she very quickly learned how to do that particular work task. But what she didn't learn how to do very quickly was that she wasn't rolling silverware very quickly. Now, within this context, I mentioned that the job, was negotiated for her from the perspective that the employment specialist in addressing the manager of this particular restaurant and exploring some of the things that weren't really getting done to the employer's needs was really that the table staff or the wait staff often would run out of silverware, so this particular job was negotiated for Jessica. Now, there really wasn't a production standard in this situation because it was a negotiated job, but if you look at the information here, and these are randomly, random observation periods across the day, and we see that she's really not rolling silverware very quickly if you say that these are 10-minute intervals, and that at her very best she's rolling 10 pieces of silverware within a 10-minute period of time. I think we all can realize that what's going on. Within this particular situation, some of the challenges were that she was getting up from her workstation and wandering around the restaurant to talk to the wait staff. Obviously, would not be perceived as a very good thing to do while the wait staff is trying to work on tables. She would ask people for assistance. She would go get more supplies when she really didn't need more supplies. Those were just some of the things that she was doing within this particular situation. The first thing that we really thought we needed to do for her was really give her some kind of idea about the expectation or what she needed to accomplish within this particular task. So we gave her a standard of that she needed to roll a minimum of 10 pieces of silverware in a 5-minute period of time. Now you'll notice that this is a little bit more stringent than the guidelines of what she was doing previously, but I would also caution you when you're trying to work through some of these programs that you don't place unrealistic expectations on people. It perhaps would have been unrealistic for us in this particular situation to have said, okay, you're only rolling 10 pieces in 10 minutes and now I want you to roll 25 pieces in 5 minutes. That's really, again, if you go back to some of my earlier thoughts about setting people up to fail, that probably would have been setting her up to fail in this particular situation. What we wanted to do, though, was try to look at the work supplies that she used, and their napkins came in packs of 50. So if we looked at this and we thought about it from a time perspective, if she did 5 pieces in 10 minutes, and we asked her to pretty much do 1 pack of 50 napkins in a 25-minute period of time, and we talked to the employer about this, and the employer was pretty satisfied with that particular scenario. Within the context of that, again, what we wanted to do was really help her to learn how to manage some of these concerns or support needs as opposed to it being always the employment specialist. Now, in this particular situation, we knew that some of it was for attention from the coworkers, attention from the employment specialist, but we also felt that she really, when we did some of that alternative explanation, that she really didn't understand the expectations that she needed to roll silverware quickly. So we gave her a timer that had a mark on it for 5 minutes. We put some small strips of tape on the table in front of her, 10 pieces representing the 10 pieces that she needed to roll in the 5-minute period of time. She rolled a piece of silverware. She placed it on a piece of tape. The clock is ticking. She knows that when she finishes, what she wants to do is fill up all those pieces of tape before the bell goes off on the timer. Then she gets to check it off on her production card. If within that 25-minute period of time, if she's done this for 5 times in a row, then the coworker comes by, checks her work, says, "Great job, Jessica. Come on up to the front and we'll greet customers." And you'll probably guess what restaurant this is without my saying, the restaurant that has a greeter at the front door. And she essentially got to go with the coworker after she finished a pack of 50 napkins in 25 minutes to be up at the front door for 10 minutes with her coworker greeting customers as they came into the restaurant. A good example perhaps of a, I don't want to call silverware as a non-preferred activity, but clearly the preferred activity was working with her coworker at the front door greeting customers. So really within the context of that, thinking about working in that relationship again, and also working with the individual to manage the situation himself or herself so that you as the employment specialist are not always doing that. So making sure that you are involving the coworker in any kind of support plan that you are coming up with, as well as thinking about from the very first day that you implement any kind of strategy in trying to support a person in the workplace is your first and foremost thought should always be, how am I going to get myself out that front door? Because the whole goal is for the person to be successful with the natural supports of those coworkers in that workplace. So be sure that you're not working yourself as part of the program when you are designing or addressing any of these concerns. I really like to make some closing comments really as we leave today, because unfortunately I think we probably could spend all day together talking. Certainly I know that you probably still have many more questions, but some of the things that I would like to leave you with is to brainstorm with your coworkers. Even brainstorm obviously with the coworkers in the workplace. Involve that person. The other thing that I would suggest to you is to learn from your mistakes. I would really say that in some situations I have learned as much from some of perhaps the mistakes I've made, and hopefully could carry some of those things on to brainstorming in a new situation or a new scenario. A final funny story, I remember one time an employment specialist calling me up on the phone and saying, I've been in the closet for the last 30 minutes because I couldn't get out. And I thought to myself, well, I guess you'll never go first into the closet again. I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but trying to cue you into learning from your mistakes. And in closing, just really trying to encourage you to include the customer always in the choices and include that individual in learning how to control the situation as opposed to having to display some type of challenge to get your attention or to control the situation. I'd like to encourage you to join me now in the chat room, and perhaps we could talk about some of these scenarios or situations, or perhaps some of you might have some things that you could share with us related to positive supports in the workplace. Thanks a lot.